Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
All right, we have a big week of reports and a lot of details to get into, but to start things off, let's recap what happened and looks like to be a very quiet week in the markets.
Yeah, if we start on the cattle side of the picture here to begin with this week, we're going to talk about cash cattle that were $1.75 higher for the week. On the feeder cattle side, most feeder cattle traded steady to $3 higher. While when we look at futures markets, those current live cattle and feeder cattle futures contracts really were unchanged for this week. On the choice box beef value, it was 50 cents lower this week on what was some substantial weakness in terms of where rib prices were for this week. On the pork side of the equation, cash barrel and gilt prices were virtually unchanged this week. Yet that February lean hog futures contract closed down $3.30 on the week. The pork cutout value lost $1.70 this week. That's more than $5.50 lower than where it was a year ago at this time. Hams and bellies really led to much of the weakness that we saw in terms of that pork cutout value.
Scott, as we take a look at these numbers, we see not a lot of movement necessarily price-wise, but we sure saw a lot of pork move through the market this week.
Yeah, if you look at overall pork production for this week, 584 million pounds of pork produced. That is an all-time record on the pork side. And even on the beef side, 546 million pounds of beef being produced this week. That's the 10th highest week ever. The combination of the two tells me we have a lot of red meat supplies out of this week's production.
And we'll get into some of those numbers a little bit later. But talking about pork production setting another record this week, according and taking a look at that Hogs and Pigs report, it doesn't necessarily look like we're going to see a slowdown in pork production anytime soon.
We're certainly going to start 2019 with pork production remaining above year-ago levels, and we might frankly look at much of 2019 in that same vein as we move forward. That's for sure.
Let's talk a little bit and get into that Hogs and Pigs report. I think one of the most interesting numbers that comes out of that report is the kept for breeding.
Yeah, so if you look at what we got in terms of breeding inventory, up 102.4 out of the report, that is a little bit below pre-report estimates, but we're continuing to talk about expansion in terms of sow numbers. I will say relative to September, we actually lost a few sows, which is the first time we've been able to say that in a while. So yes, we're growing. Maybe the rate of growth is starting to slow just a little bit and might be more helpful for us in 2019. A few things stick out to me. If you look at pigs per litter, September through November, only up 0.2%. That was below pre-report estimates, suggesting a few less pigs than pigs per litter than we might have thought otherwise. The other one that sticks out to me is that inventory of hogs weighing less than 50 pounds, only up 0.9% relative to a year ago. The pre-report midpoint was 102.5. That might give us a situation where late spring we're going to talk about a lower growth in terms of those hog runs in late spring, given what we see out of that Hogs and Pigs report.
Are we also still watching and monitoring production capacity and slaughter capacity here as we look at what another plant coming online, I'm assuming sometime early 2019?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be fine in terms of capacity, but thank goodness we have had all this capacity come on board over the last 18, 24 months. We'll continue to talk about, I think, when we get in late 2019 about record levels of pork production again. I don't think we're done setting those records, just given the kind of growth that we see out of this report and what we expect to continue in terms of growth in 2019.
That's it really for Hogs and Pigs report. Let's talk a little cattle on feed as we take a look at those numbers. Talk to me a little bit about cattle placements for November.
Yeah, if we look at those cattle placed in November, it came in at down 4.9%. That continues that trend of what I think we thought we were going to see. We placed a lot of calves early this year as a result of some of the dry weather, and now we're kind of reaping the benefits of that as we tighten things up. So it's nice to talk about placements down again this month relative to a year ago. If we look at on feed as of December 1, we are still higher. So I don't want us to forget about we're growing, overall cattle on feed inventory. It's came in at 101.9. That's pretty close to the pre-report estimate. But more cattle on feed as we look at that report.
How much has weather come into play possibly as a factor in all of this, especially on the cattle side of things?
Yeah, so I think we have seen weather, play a role here. We've seen maybe some better wheat pasture in some parts of the country that I think have now also kept some calves out there a little longer than normally would be the case. So it's been a tale of two cities here, where early on I think drought in some parts of the country got us to place cattle earlier. Now I think we see some demand for wheat pasture as we've seen some late fall rain that has helped on that side. So I think both those things have really held down placements as we look at that November placement number.
The other big report that came out yesterday, livestock slaughter, as we take a look at those numbers, really there's just a glut of meat, both beef and pork combined.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes as you sit here and look at the numbers and you go, oh, record production out here, that's a problem. I remind both cattle and hog producers, I want to live in an industry that's growing over time. Now we have to find the demand for that additional supplies of beef and pork, and that's where we're going to continue to have to watch things as we move forward. But when you look at what we got out of the livestock slaughter report, beef production for November at 2.3 billion pounds. That's 1% higher than where we were a year ago at this time. Pork production at nearly 2.4 billion pounds. That's 5% higher than we were a year ago at this time. If you look at overall January through November red meat production, 49 billion pounds, 3% higher. None of that, I guess, is surprising, but it just reminds us we're in an expansionary phase here. And thank goodness we've had some strong demand growth, certainly domestically, but as well internationally in some cases, that has really helped prices for cattle and hogs stay higher than maybe we would have thought traditionally under this kind of growth in production.
I would say not only that this kind of growth in production, but some of that trade shift and some of the uncertainty that's come into play there as well. Where are there some markets that we're seeing expansion and growth in around the world that are helping to offset this massive production?
So I think so. I always start by we talk a lot about pork trade and the problems that have resulted as tariffs have been put in place on many pork products. We're still going to be higher in terms of the amount of pork we exported out of the United States in 2018. We'll be about 1% higher. You start looking at the beef side of the equation. I'll say places like Japan and Korea have been really strong in terms of demand for U.S. beef. I think all those things have been helpful in pushing more beef out of the United States as well. So it's been a combination of stronger domestic and international demand that has given us a much better balance relative to that big supply number and kept prices where they are.
Let's talk a little bit about beef cow slaughter as we take a look at the livestock slaughter report, because that dropped this month.
Yeah, so since the first time since January of 2016, we can actually talk about beef cow slaughter being below year-ago levels. I don't want to read too much into that data point at this point in time, but it reminds me that maybe all else equal, we'll have a few more cows than we would have thought earlier on. I think that's a little bit of a function of what's been some pasture recovery in many parts that were dry in the early part of 2018. I think we got some pretty strong fall growth in many parts of the country, not everywhere, but certainly we can take a state like Missouri here where we got some pretty good fall growth. I think that might have helped us curb what was otherwise had been some pretty strong beef cow slaughter numbers.
And to wrap up the gift of great reports this week, cold storage numbers came out earlier today. And again, there is a lot of beef and pork and poultry here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at beef and to begin with here, 6% higher as we ended November in terms of beef ending stocks at about 515 million pounds. That on the pork side, we're 1% higher at 507 million pounds, so higher in both relative to a year ago levels. We're sitting at 4% higher stocks of red meat in total, surpassing 1 billion pounds of red meat stocks at the end of November. On the poultry side, we were talking about higher poultry stocks relative to a year ago. However, we did fall relative to where we were last month. So perhaps we're getting that poultry side in a little better shape than where we were a month ago. But all in all, some growing freezer supplies of red meats and poultry.
On the poultry side of things, Scott, though, what would cause a shift like that? I mean, that's down a pretty significant number on the month, while we're still above where we were a year ago.
Yeah, so I do think we're talking about production that's maybe come into a little better balance relative to what we've seen on the demand side. If you look at prices that have been accruing to the poultry industry, you don't have to look beyond really breast prices to see what have been, in many cases, record low prices to start to curb that production side. So I think we are starting to see that little better balance going on in the chicken side of the equation.
Scott, as we wrap things up, so this will be the last time I talk to you in 2018. I'll be on vacation next week. But as we look ahead to 2019, my assumption is demand is going to be the one thing that we're going to be talking about a lot.
Seems to me as we look forward in 2019, it's number one, what's going to happen to the U.S. economy, what's going to happen to job growth, all those things really important to what's going to be another year of growing supplies of meat on the marketplace. On top of that, we're going to talk about what happens to tariffs. Do we get a USMCA in place where we can talk about eliminating tariffs on things like hams in 2019 that helps us on the pork side? As well as we know, conversations ongoing with China about what happens to tariffs there. All those things remain critical as we move into 2019, and no, we're going to face growing supplies of meat again.
And I think one last thing to note, what the USDA is issuing that second round of MFP payments today, ahead of what potentially could have been could be a government shutdown over the weekend. So there'll be a lot of things to keep an eye out on, but a nice little Christmas present for those folks that have been struggling a little bit this year.
It will certainly come at a good time for some of these producers who are going to have to start thinking about operating notes for 2019 and what they plan on doing to have a little more cash in hand as they close out 2018. So it is good to see those second round payments going out and being helpful to what were lower soybean prices for sure than what many producers would have thought as they entered 2018.
Scott, the next time I see you, it'll be in person at the Missouri Cattlemen's Convention. We will chat there and do an outlook and a market recap then. Have a Merry Christmas. And John Perkins will be in next Friday filling in.
Very good. Happy holidays to you, Megan. Enjoy your time off, and I will see you in the lovely state of Missouri in early January.
Yes, we will. So our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning. Visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins Market Minute. For Shannon Yoakley, Scott Brown, and myself, we wish you all a very Merry Christmas. I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.